All right, well, welcome. Welcome to everybody here and also our online audience. I am going to say a few words about upcoming events before I hand things over to Patricia here, who is going to be doing a fantastic presentation for us. We're all very excited. So you have to wait. Because first you need to know that on June 26th, we're also going to have a really cool presentation. We're going to have a presentation by Jacqueline Fair, hopefully Yuki Matsuno, who's in the audience, and Rowan Meredith on introversion and the way that introversion interconnects with different dispute resolution processes. So we have a mediator, we have a tax dispute resolution professional, and we have a young law student who's engaging for the first time with legal processes. And they're going to discuss the different ways that it actually can cause some interesting challenges and some benefits to come from a place of introversion. So it should be a really interesting talk. We're then going to have, I need to remind everybody, and I know we've got a few people here who've already put up their hands and said they're going to do something, but September 27th, Wednesday, September 27th, that is our speed geeking session. And let me once again tell you, speed geeking, it is an awesome thing that should happen all the time in every event. At this time in dispute resolution, it is a chance for anybody who has come across any interesting little thing that they think, oh, that is the kernel of the greatest idea ever for dispute resolution. They only need to spend 5 minutes talking about it and sharing how excited you are about the idea. We will videotape you. You will have an opportunity to have it float out there on your own website if you've done a really great job, or kill it if you didn't. Doesn't really matter, but you take 5 minutes and you'll have 5 minutes of question time. So come with something that you think would be really interesting, and I especially encourage people, if you're looking at things that are really cross-disciplinary, and saying, oh, you know, the way that fits with dispute resolution is really interesting and I'd love to tease that out. At least for 5 minutes, float it out there and see what other people think about it. Bring those ideas to us. And just shoot me a note if it's something that you want to do, and we'll start announcing what those different things are going to be as soon as we start having more than the trickle that I've got so far. On that note, reminder about our directional microphone, just in case you're thrown by the fact that we have a video camera in the back this time. Questions. A reminder, you will have to step in front of the camera. You don't have to stand on screen, but you do have to step up here in order to be heard, okay? And for folks who are online, what I'm talking about with the other camera, we are testing something this time, just in case we have any problems with the live stream. We are also recording it on video, and we will upload that video to replace anything that doesn't work. Okay, so you'll get it one way or the other. All right. Patricia, I'm going to invite you to talk about decolonizing and indigenizing reconciliation.
Thank you, Sharon. So before I begin this evening, I'd like to acknowledge that we're on the unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations, and that as a Métis person from Alberta, I am an uninvited guest on these territories where I work and live. And I am grateful to the Coast Salish peoples who host me as a guest in their traditional territories. I'd also like to thank CORE for having me here today, and especially Sharon for all of her work in organizing this. I can be a bit disorganized with all the things I have going on, so it definitely took some effort for her to pin me down and make it happen. So I'm really happy to be here today to talk to all of you. So while there's a lot of public discourse right now since the release of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's final reports and calls to action, that continues to emphasize reconciliation, there is also a deep questioning, I think, from a lot of different people and a lot of different entities about how we do that work. What does it mean to meaningfully engage in the work of reconciliation? And I think that probably in the process of that debate, something gets lost, and that thing that gets lost really is truth-telling. So what do I mean by that when I say truth-telling? I'm talking about centering the truth as it relates to the history of Indigenous peoples in Canada and the legacy and the ongoing impact of colonization. And I don't think that we can get really to a meaningful process of reconciliation until we know how to deal with those things in the work that we do, especially in the work that we do within legal systems. So my inspiration for this notion of decolonizing and indigenizing comes from the work of a lot of other Indigenous folks across Canada who, well, and across North America and globally, who are dealing with these issues, who are grappling with the notions of both how we decolonize systems that already exist, and then how we indigenize those systems if they're going to have meaningful conversation with Indigenous ways of being and knowing. And I think in order to meaningfully engage in reconciliation, that's something that's going to have to happen. So when it comes to thinking about the profound significance of reconciliation and the fact that people seem to be more inclined to focus on reconciliation rather than the truths coming out of the TRC reports, I think that we need to pause and say, what are those truths? You know, what does that mean for the work that we're doing? And so I'm going to take us through a brief, very brief, truncated sort of analysis or summary of the TRC executive report, just so we have the numbers in mind, just so that when we think about this conversation as we move forward tonight, we're not doing that in a vacuum. We're doing it in the presence of that truth. So the individual stories of the survivors of residential schools in Canada is not simply a dark chapter of Canada's history. They are a collective memory of the truth about genocide in Canada. And that's really what we're talking about, is genocide. Taken separately, each story from a survivor is a set of facts, as we might think of it in law, or truths, which through the Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement process was made to be corroborated by historical research and documentation, and then tested for credibility and reliability. And taken together, these truths actually form a much greater and more terrible truth that is undeniable. And that larger collective truth actually disrupts the idea that we've entered or achieved an age of reconciliation. It challenges us to consider how we'll meaningfully engage in the ongoing process of reconciliation while the colonial project is still ongoing in Canada. So, looking through the history and the legacy of residential schools in order to situate this discussion, I'm going to ask you as participants to think critically and self-reflect about your ideas about settler colonialism and the history of Indigenous settler relations in Canada and the current debate about reconciliation. I'm going to ask you to think about what historical and present truths must be acknowledged and understood before a meaningful conversation about reconciliation can really begin. And I recognize that that's an uncomfortable thing to ask everyone. I recognize that that's an uncomfortable set of truths that we have to think about. But I think that we have to do it. If we don't do that work, we can't begin to talk about reconciliation, because if nobody can talk about the truths, then how do we ever talk about how to reconcile them? So, in focusing today on truth-telling, in order to ask these questions about what meaningful reconciliation must look like, I'm not suggesting that reconciliation is not a fine end goal. It certainly is. I think that we can perhaps move towards it at some point in the future. But because what we're mostly unable to do is talk about the truth, we end up without a meaningful conversation about reconciliation. We just sort of have what I think is lip service, really. So we need to think about what has been lost and what still needs to be addressed when it comes to the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians. And the discussion about reconciliation concerns me as it is right now, because it doesn't seem to want to actually address the harms of the past. It clearly focuses on the idea that we can just move forward at this point. And in doing so, I say, and I think other people would say too, that it silences the voices of survivors and of Indigenous peoples and communities who have suffered these harms. And so I argue that reconciliation is not enough at this point. It's not an appropriate remedy for the harms done. And I say remedy rather than compensation in this context because there's no way to compensate for genocide. The settlement process and the compensations that came out of it were a gesture, and a very fine gesture, as was the apology of the Prime Minister of Canada. But they will never be enough. And I think that really when we talk about reconciliation, what we're talking about is getting to a place where we can build relationships together that actually are built on a foundation of these truths. So rather than provide a fulsome history of residential schools today, which would be a lot, and I acknowledge that it is a complex and lengthy history, I'm going to give a brief overview of the history and legacy of residential schools. And then I'm going to speak about some of the truth of the survivors' experiences, particularly within the legal framework and enactment of the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, so the TRC reports being based on that, and then how this current discussion about reconciliation sort of replicates some of the violence of colonialism, even through that process. So yes, I'll begin by providing a brief overview. So we'll move to the next slide. The residential school system in Canada was a protracted policy aimed at, and I'm quoting, removing the Indian from the child, end quote, and destroying children's connections to their Indigenous families and communities by decimating language and culture over time. Children who were forced to attend left residential schools carrying the trauma of years of abuse. Many, of course, also died at the schools, and their families and communities were never able to properly mourn them. Canada's motivation for establishing residential schools was founded in a concerted attempt to abrogate its legal commitments to Indigenous peoples and communities based on the promises originally set out in the Royal Proclamation and asserted through the obligations set out in the 1870 Order of Her Majesty and Councils admitting Rupert's Land to the Northwest Territory into the Union. Despite these commitments, Canada engaged in an active campaign to assimilate Indigenous individuals, interrupt the transfer of traditional knowledge between generations, and destroy Indigenous cultures and communities. European beliefs about law, especially those about property, shaped their attitudes towards Indigenous nations they encountered in what would become Canada, and the doctrine of discovery was relied upon to assert that the lands occupied or inhabited by non-Christians were not technically owned in that sense of a European idea of property, and were therefore discoverable. The concept of terra nullius, Latin for nobody's land, was premised on the notion that land which was occupied but not owned in this European style sort of agriculture and development sense was not being used, and that was used to further justify the theft of Indigenous lands. So we also have, of course, the very, very specific cultural beliefs that Europeans held about their superiority over other peoples, and that those in the civilizing mission became something that both was buttressed by and fed into the notions of scientific racism. These two things spoke to each other in a very harmonious conversation that allowed Europeans to believe that they really were the superior racial and cultural folks. So I've put here a brief point about the 1880 pass system, which was created with no legal authority. And if you don't know what the pass system was, it's that as people were moved on to reserves in Canada, they had to obtain a pass from the Indian agent in order to leave those reserves. So people were literally confined to the lands that they were relegated to on reserve, and they were not allowed to leave despite whatever it was that they might have needed. So for a lot of nations, that meant that if they had been very reliant on hunting, for example, or if they had been a community that moved from spring to fall and winter encampments or land-based places, they could no longer do that. So that also later buttressed further the issue of parents trying to leave the control of the state over parents when they tried to leave to either collect their children from residential schools or even go visit them. So when children were removed from their families and communities, that was done with no legal authority whatsoever. There was no legal basis by which the Canadian state or the churches were able to remove children, but they just did it. And in many cases, they told parents that they would be put in jail if they did not give their children up, even though there was no legal basis for it. And lots of people were jailed, which meant that if they were trying to take children who were a little bit older, those children might be left without their parents if they resisted. And not only would those children be left without their parents, but younger children who really were dependent on those parents were left alone. So it was a very difficult situation, to say the very least. We can go to the next slide. So the Royal Proclamation, which I mentioned, set out Canada's legal responsibilities to Indigenous peoples, and determined that making treaties with First Nations was actually a process as between sovereigns. It was a nation-to-nation agreement. And Indigenous leaders who made and signed on to treaties with Canada as they moved across the country were aware of the specificity of the Royal Proclamation and considered their treaties as nation-to-nation agreements, securing reciprocal relationships. So in the historical documentation, you actually see many First Nations trying to rely on that to fight Canada when Canada wasn't living up to its treaty obligations from the get-go, very early, including in trying to resist residential schools and what was happening to them. So there are a number of examples here of various treaties that were made. Treaty of Niagara, which was very early on, and then of course the numbered treaties across Canada, but not including BC, of course. We can move to the next slide. So, more specifically, when speaking about residential schools, at Confederacy, Canada began to see its relationship to Indigenous peoples really as one of superiority and paternalism, and no longer were Indigenous communities considered as nations of allies, but they were considered as less than and in need of management. And Indigenous peoples and communities, really, the TRC says, were to be managed until they could be eradicated or assimilated. So although there were education provisions as a part of the treaties, and these were different in each of the different treaties, Indigenous communities never asked for residential schools as a part of the treaty process, and neither did the government suggest that such schools would be established. Instead, the treaties, and again these took different forms, indicated that the government would pay for schools and teachers on reserves within the communities themselves. And the federal government was, of course, unable to or did not make good on that promise, and in partnership with the churches, recognized that they could do this just in a much cheaper fashion at the end of the day. So indeed today, still, many reserves across Canada do not have K through 12 education systems. Children are forced still today to leave their homes to attend school. So all over the country, especially from northern reserve communities, children have to live in motels or boarding homes in communities that are hundreds, if not many hundreds and hundreds of if not thousands even, of kilometers away from their communities. They are completely alone, and they are in many cases unable to deal with the stress of that and how it affects them. So in many cases they choose to go home rather than complete high school, or we've seen even more tragic consequences coming out of that, where children die by suicide because they're not able to deal with the loneliness and the dislocation that they feel. So according to the TRC, children were sent to residential schools to protect them from the influence of their own parents and culture. Like reserves, the schools themselves were places of isolation in which children were to be civilized and assimilated and converted to Christianity. Quoting from page 62 of the executive summary, they say, as with all Aboriginal policies, the schools were funded in a cost-conscious manner that no matter what one thought of their goals, they were doomed to fail from the very beginning. So even prior to the official policy foundation for the civilizing mission was laid, Christian missionary organizations were attempting to civilize and Christianize Indigenous peoples through boarding schools for children. Some of these schools existed in North America as early as the 17th century, and there were numerous church-run schools operating pre-Confederation. The official national program was administered by various church organizations from 1883 to 1969 through government funding. Post-1969, it was administered by the Canadian government directly. Next slide. So according to the final report of the TRC, 7 generations of children were removed from their families and communities. Children were not allowed to speak their languages, practice cultural beliefs, or maintain familial bonds with siblings and cousins. The schools operated in tandem with legislation preventing Indigenous communities from engaging in traditional cultural practices, which were deemed illegal. And Canada estimates that at least 150,000 children attended residential schools. The last of the schools did not close until the mid to late 1990s. So I was actually talking with somebody about this the other day because I was certain that the last school closed in 1977 somewhere on Vancouver Island, but then somebody was saying that it was 1995 in Saskatchewan, and I don't think that was right, but I do think it was around
96. Yeah, I've heard
96.
96, yeah.
So I haven't been able to actually locate that for some reason when I've been looking through the reports. I know it's there somewhere though, so I want to try to get that right. So 96 in Saskatchewan. Okay. Next slide. Thousands of children died in school. They say as many as 6,000. There were many of these graves are unmarked, so communities were never able to properly mourn and families, the children that were lost. You may or may not have read some news articles about the fact that the schools were the sites of experiments, such as those attempting to measure the impact of nutritional deprivation on health. Physical, psychological, and sexual abuse were regular occurrences for the children at the schools, and children as young as 3 were taken from home. I know that when I worked for the residential, Indian residential school settlement agreement process here in Vancouver, I worked for the West sort of section, that when I would go through the school records, I would regularly see children admitted at the age of 3 and 4 on the rolls. And then if those children lived, they often did not leave until they were 18. Next slide. So in speaking to the history of settler colonial violence and genocide in Canada, I feel like it's very important for me to actually situate myself in this work. And one of the reasons that I do that is because it gives us, if we want an example to talk about, a concrete example to talk about. And it's a concrete example that allows us to potentially engage in an active discussion. I know that there are some limitations potentially around that in this forum, but I do welcome you at any time to please step up and discuss any of the things that you're thinking and feeling as we move through this, because I think that at the end of the day, what we're really doing, in talking through this information is trying to ground ourselves, each of us individually, in these truths. And I think that when we do that, we create space to actually engage in meaningful dialogue about it. And I think that that's the only way that we're going to be able to move forward. So, in the work that I do as a lawyer and an educator, it is informed by my experiences as a Métis woman. And it's impossible to talk about myself actually without also talking about my family, who I am from. So in the next slide, you're going to see some of my family members. This is Grandpa Jack on this side. In the middle is my papa. It's my grandfather, and on the other side is Lil. And my family in this picture, as they're depicted, so my Grandpa Jack is Métis, and Lil, who is my papa's mother, is Norwegian. But I self-identify as Métis because of the way that my family history is unfolded, which I'm going to tell you a little bit about now. So I'm descended from Métis families of the historical Métis Nation of the Northwest. My grandfather, or Papa, as he's referred to, is Theodore Colin McMurray, and though he bears the name McMurray, it's important to note that that is the name of no one that we are related to. Rather, it's the name of a man that my great-grandmother, who was known as Frosine, and then later Grandma Mac, was in a relationship with for many years. So my papa changed his name out of respect for his grandmother, and our family name became McMurray. My papa's mother, Lil, who was from Norway, sadly developed schizophrenia. She may have had it always, we're not really sure. Medical history wasn't great back then. But she was institutionalized actually not long after this photo was taken. And that also alludes to a different terrible chapter of Canada's history, but one that we're not talking about today. So my papa was raised basically by my great-grandfather, Grandpa Jack, and his relations. My great-grandfather, John Colin Fraser, known as Grandpa Jack, was Métis from both the Lac La Biche Métis community and the Lac Sainte Anne community, and both of those communities, through our genealogical ties, had ties back to Red River. So Grandpa Jack, as he was called, was born in 1901 in Edmonton. He lived with his mother and her various, we'll call them consorts, over the years, and her relations in Lac La Biche for most of his life. They spoke predominantly Cree, and a little bit of Michif and a little bit of French, but not English. And Grandpa Jack, when he was probably, we figure around the age of 6, was forced into residential school. So growing up, my papa and his siblings were then not taught Cree. The exception being to speak with horses, actually. And in fact, we're told that they were only to speak English, though Grandpa Jack and his mother and all of their relations spoke Cree almost always. So Grandpa Jack's trauma from his time at residential school translated into various intergenerational traumas that continue to this day in my family, including a deep distrust of education and the Catholic Church, as well as deeply rooted internalized racism. And although, go to the next slide, and although Grandpa Jack was a fiddler, this is his fiddle, he taught no one to fiddle, and he taught no one our songs. And the impact of intergenerational trauma runs deep and takes generations to work through. So, for example, as a result of some of that mistrust of formal education, my generation was the first to complete secondary schooling. And I was the first person in my mother's family to obtain a high school diploma. And I'm also the first to have gone on to obtain any post-secondary degrees. It's also important to note, though, that my last name, which is Barkaskas, is not a Métis name. In fact, it's a Lithuanian name. There should be a U in the middle of it. It's supposed to be Barkaskas. But my father's father, who that name is from, died when my father was about 12. And then my father's mother, who I really didn't spend very much time with my father's family. We have ship manifests that say that she came over with her mother from Croatia, but then the rest of the family variously says that they are Ukrainian or Hungarian or sometimes even Czechoslovakian has been identified. So I don't really know, and I don't know my father's people. I didn't grow up being close to them, and I didn't know them, which is also why I don't, despite having this last name, and despite that being part of who I am, is not how I culturally identify, because I just didn't know that part of my family, and really didn't obtain a lot of cultural knowledge from them. So, we can move to the next slide. So, the reason I talk about intergenerational trauma is because I think it's really important to remember that when we're dealing with people who have had experiences in their families where there's been a residential school where somebody has survived residential school, that the impact of that does last generations in various ways. I mean, there are all kinds of ways that my family has been impacted by it, and that was my great-grandfather. It wasn't my mother, it wasn't my grandfather, it was my great-grandfather. And it still affects our family today. There are people in my family who still won't identify as Métis because they feel a deep internalized racism, I think. They really would loathe to be seen that way because they feel like it's still very stigmatizing. So in many cases when we're dealing directly, and I think that this is especially important for people who are working, of course, as mediators and in alternative dispute resolution, you know, I just don't think you can make any assumptions about how these things might affect people. Because I certainly know that people might not expect me, for example, to be deeply impacted by these things still today when they look at me or think about who I am or the way that I've succeeded in the world. But I am all the time, and that directly impacts the work that I end up doing. So I think that it can't go without saying that we are all impacted by it, because I think that everybody sitting in this room is too, whether as directly as my family was, or more directly, or potentially indirectly. But by virtue of the fact that this is our collective history, we are all impacted by it. And that means that we all have a responsibility in moving forward in terms of dealing with the conversation that we have to have, which is not going to be easy. It's a difficult conversation to have, to think about. For me, you know, it was a difficult thing to think about all the time in my life, and I didn't really understand it as a child. It made no sense to me that somehow my father's mother, my grandmother, had a farm. She had this beautiful, an original like homestead piece of land just north of Edmonton along the Yellowhead Highway, and various members of my father's family all had pieces of land like that. Giant swaths of land that they were given by the Canadian government, while my mother's people were forced off of their traditional territory. While they were, I mean, as Métis people, not even given a land base. And the cruel irony of that was something that I grew up grappling with, or trying to grapple with, you know, not really understanding how that happened. And I think that is something that affects all of us. You know, it's an example of one of the ways that when we look around and see distribution of space and place, and that's allocated through the law, right, that we have a lot to think about in terms of where we all fit into that equation, and then what we can do about it. So, we move on to the next slide. If you haven't read either the executive summary or any of the reports of the TRC, I would say that you should do so. I'd say read them all, but we're all busy people. So reading the executive summary is really going to give you a lot of information about the background of this entire history. But honestly, read the survivors speak. If you're only going to read one thing, read what the survivors have to say about their experiences, because from those words, you're going to gain so much wisdom about what it means to have survived these schools, and what we should be thinking about when we think about reconciliation. Next slide. So, in the survivors speak, the survivors obviously talk about their experiences, but they also talk about their resilience And I think that's also a really important thing to emphasize. And I know that when I deal with sentencing, and I'm doing a sentencing for an Indigenous person, and we're doing Gladue submissions, I don't just focus on the trauma that they have experienced. I also focus on the way that they have survived, how they have been resilient, and what that means for them. Because I think that demonstrating that to the court is incredibly important, because it also speaks to the ways that they are able to continue to be resilient, that they can in fact deal with the issues that they are facing, and that they are not, they are not just made up of their trauma. And that's a really, really important thing, I think. So we can move on to the next slide. These are big, wordy slides because they're actually quotes from the survivors speak, which I think are just really important to bring into the room. I think it's really important, if we're going to talk about reconciliation, that we do so with acknowledgement through the words of some of the survivors of what their experiences are. So maybe, because it's supposed to be an interactive session, and I'm a mean person, maybe I'll ask for a person to come up and volunteer to read each of these slides. I mean, different people could read different ones. But I think that actually bringing the words into the room is a significant gesture. And if no one else wants to do it, I will do it. But you might be sick of my voice already.
I'm way meaner than you, Patricia. Somebody's going to do it. Come on, there'll be a few. Somebody step up and take the first one. There we go. Got our first volunteer. The only reason that you do need to kind of come and just be oriented so you can be heard on the...
Okay.
So you just need to be in front of the camera. You don't necessarily need to be on screen.
Like over here?
Yeah, that works.
When I think back to my childhood, it brings back memories. Really nice memories of how life was as Anishinaabe. As you know, how we lived before we were sent to school. And the things that I remember, the legends at night that my dad used to tell us, stories, and how he used to show us how to trap and funny things that happened. You know, there's a lot of things that are still in my thoughts of how we were loved by our parents. They really cared for us, and it was such a good life, you know. It's doing the things like it was free. We were free, I guess is the word I'm looking for, is a real free environment of us. I'm not saying that we didn't get disciplined if we did something wrong. You know, there was that, but it was a friendly, like a loving discipline, if you will. And that was Bob Baxter.
Thank you. This one's very short. Maybe I'll just read it. So this is a quote from Paul Stanley, and he says, when you're thinking back to being with his parents before residential school, he says, when you're in bed with Papa and he tells you about your first story, and it's about how the chipmunk got his stripes, and it was so funny to me, you know, that I asked him to say it every night.
My parents were told that we had to go to the residential school. And prior to that, at times, my dad didn't make very much money. So sometimes he would go to the welfare to get ration or get some monies to support 12 of us. And my parents were told that if they didn't put us in the residential school, that all that would be cut off. So my parents felt forced to put us in the residential school. 8 of us, 8 out of 12. Vitaline, Elsie, Jenner.
Howard Stacey Jones said he was taken without his parents' knowledge from a public school in Port Renfrew, British Columbia, to the Cooper Island School. I was kidnapped from Port Renfrew Elementary School when I was around 6 years old, and this happened right in the elementary schoolyard. And my auntie witnessed this, and another non-native witnessed this. And they are still alive as I speak. These are two witnesses saw me fighting, trying to get away from the two RCMP officers that threw me in the back seat of the car and drove off with me. And my mom didn't know where I was for 3 days, frantically stressed out and worried about where I was. And she finally found out that I was in Cooper Island Residential School.
Alan Knockwood recalled being strapped for speaking his own language at Shubenacadie. Just for saying thank you to someone who gave me something in the school. I was caught by a brother or one of the workers, and I was strapped so severely that when we went to supper, my cousin Ivan had to feed me because my hands were so swollen from the straps. And I remember sitting at the corner of the table, and the guys got up and hid me, stood up and hid, so Ivan could feed me a few mouthfuls of food.
Richard Kyogan also attended the Coppermine Tent Hostel. But over the years, if you talk in your own language, you get strapped. And later on, I had to learn the hard way about myself. I think over the years, I earned that. We earn it, take this education. One time I got strapped and I didn't want to get strapped anymore, so I said to myself, what am I here for? Education, I guess. Anyway, my culture is going to be, my language will be lost in the way. Okay. Why not think like a white man, talk like a white man, eat like a white man? That's what. So I don't have to get strapped anymore. I followed their own rules.
There are also reports of students being forced to eat soap if they were caught speaking an Aboriginal language. Periette Benjamin said this happened at the school at Latuke. They put a big chunk and they put it in my mouth. And the principal, she put it in my mouth and she said, eat it, eat it. And she just showed me what to do. She told me to swallow it. And she put her hand in front of my mouth. So I was chewing and chewing and I had to swallow it. So I swallowed it. And then I had to open my mouth to show I had swallowed it. And at the end, I understood, and she told me, that's a dirty language. That's the devil that speaks in your mouth. So we had to wash it because it's dirty. So every day I spent at the residential school, I was treated badly. I was almost slaughtered.
The whole part of the residential school was a part of a bigger scheme of colonization. There was intent. The schools were there with the intent to change people, to make them like others, and to make them not fit. And today, we have to learn to decolonize. And that was Shirley Flowers.
So when the TRC was doing its reports, was putting them together, one of the things that they focused on and thought about was that the settlement process and the way that it took place was actually a continuation of some of this abuse, really, this kind of violence, because there were lawyers who engaged in all kinds of hideous behavior, and who did not approach the people that they were working with any kind of sensitivity whatsoever. And I think that that's part of what they were turning their minds to in the calls to action when they talked about the responsibility on the legal profession moving forward in terms of reconciling and learning about how to work properly with Indigenous people in our various roles. So when I think about that, we can go to the next slide, I come back to this idea of truth-telling and of listening and of accepting and learning to know that the way that we think sometimes as people who have been trained in the legal profession does not do justice to the justice that we are trying to achieve for Indigenous peoples. So I want you to think about, in your roles, the differences between truths and facts, because sometimes they're not the same thing, but a lot of the time maybe they should be. And we should think maybe about storytelling as a process of truth-telling. I know with the clients that we often work with at the Indigenous Community Legal Clinic that they often don't know what their truth is until they've had a chance to tell their story a number of times, because there's a lot going on in that story that needs to be worked through, that needs to be thought about, that they need to process, and that they are having an opportunity, maybe for the first time ever, to process with somebody who is trying to help them with an issue that they are facing. And I think that in that process, we get to this place where we need to question what we think we know as experts, and maybe think about the fact that we aren't the experts in these situations, that our clients or the people that we are working with are actually the experts on their own lives, and that their truth that they might share with us through their storytelling is going to be, should be the thing that we are listening to in order to lead us through the work that we are doing with them. So how do we do this? How do we do some of this work in terms of listening and learning in order to convey the histories and the stories of Indigenous peoples in Canada to the courts or other institutional bodies, or when we're assisting them in legal processes, and hopefully in a way that doesn't simply re-traumatize or re-stigmatize them. Go to the next slide. So I was at a CLEBC conference recently. It was the Rights of Children conference. It was 2 days, it was fantastic, it was amazing. And one of the speakers who spoke was Allard who is amazing, powerful, fabulous lawyer, and just an incredible, incredible thinker. And she talked about 4 primary areas of cultural competency for lawyers or people working in the legal profession. And she was able to just boil it down into these amazingly coherent, succinct concepts. And so with full acknowledgement to her, I am presenting them here today to you. Because they were so good, I was unable to not write them down and then say, these are what people need to know. So thank you very much, Allard, because these are what people need to know and what we need to think about. So the first is truth-telling. And in truth-telling, we need to, in the work that we do, address the continued barriers and the legacy of colonialism embedded in the Canadian legal system. So for me, when I think about the justice system, for example, that means really thinking about the fact that there isn't a justice system in Canada for Indigenous people. There's only an injustice system. And it is run through the state apparatus, and it works very efficiently. And I have to think about how all the pieces of that apparatus are barriers to actually achieving justice for clients in their encounters with the law. And next slide. This statement that was made at the conference was, to me, so powerfully accurate that I just, again, I think that it's so worth acknowledging the way that law has been weaponized against Indigenous people in this country, and so how do we not do that? How do we move forward and make sure that we're not using the law as a weapon against the people that we're trying to work with? Next slide. So number 2, looking inward at ourselves as legal practitioners and admitting biases and how and why these are replicated through law and legal processes and policies. So sometimes in the work that we do, I know that even myself, sometimes I find that I am thinking like a lawyer. I'm thinking the way I've been trained to think like a lawyer. I was in a conversation about 3 weeks ago with a client I was doing an intake with at our clinic, and she kept stopping me every time I asked her a question and saying, "Can you please ask that question in an open-ended way?" And I struggled so hard to get through the interview, and at one point she could tell I was incredibly frustrated with myself mostly. And she just put her hand on my shoulder and she said, "You know, you've got a law degree, you can do this." And I was like, "You're right, I can, I really can." Yeah, thank you for that, because she was so empathetic to my situation, but she needed that. She was a 60s scoop survivor, and she was so traumatized by all of the ways that the state had ever engaged with her that she needed me to only deal with her in a way where I was asking her open-ended questions. She was so triggered by a question that was at all interrogative that it was pointless. She couldn't do that with me. So I had to reshape myself in that moment to try to respond to her appropriately. And that was the appropriate thing to do, was to try to make sure that I was doing what she needed me to do so that I could better assist her. And so we see these things, we learn them all the time we learn them in law school, we learn them in, various training that we do, that there are ways that we, ideally are supposed to deal with people, or that we're like the best way to get the facts, the best way to get the information, and it's just not always the best way. So admitting how, the work that we do is a part of the problem is part of the solution going forward, I think. And, we can move to the next slide. I think part of that is always keeping in mind that Indigenous peoples have been criminalized and marginalized and problematized, but not supported. And I think that's really important to keep in mind, because really at the end of the day, what it takes to support somebody when you're working with them, if they have been criminalized, marginalized, and problematized, is a lot. I was just up in Whitehorse at a Revisioning Justice in the Yukon conference last week, which was being held in the same venue as the Murdered and Missing Women and Girls inquiry was starting, and it was so powerful to be there in that place, in the moment where you saw families coming into the venue to go and to bear witness to their truths, and we were talking about what could it mean to revision justice so that it worked for Indigenous people. And one of the things that happened when I was up there was that I had a chance to speak with some youth, and one of these youth was a 15-year-old boy who had just a week and a half before run his own 3-hour bail hearing because he couldn't get his lawyer there, and duty counsel was telling him that because his lawyer couldn't be there, he should go into youth detention center for almost a week and wait for his lawyer, because he had so many breaches, because he had, on different charges, 2 sets of conditions, one that told him he had to live with his father and the other one that said he couldn't live with his father. And so he had so many breaches that duty counsel was like, I can't take responsibility for running this bail hearing because you're gonna get detained, and I don't want that on my head. You need to talk to your lawyer, you need to have a plan. You know, and this kid was like, you know, he was so amazing. He said, you know what, I can explain that to the judge. I can tell the judge why this has happened to me and why I have all these breaches, and actually that these breaches aren't fair. And he did. He ran his own bail hearing at 15 because he couldn't get access to the kind of justice that he deserved in that moment. And that's not being supported. That's being criminalized and marginalized and problematized and not supported. And I think that we have to think about that in all the work that we do, right? How we can be supportive, how we can change that and say, all right, what do we do differently? I mean, and maybe that means doing it in every single situation. And, you know, that goes to the next slide and the next of artists' next to artists' 4 points, which is acknowledging and committing to change. So choosing reconciliation, actively choosing it, not talking about it, not just accepting that maybe it's something that's happened and we can all feel better now, but really choosing it in everything that you do all the time, in the conversations that you have, in the conversations that you might otherwise walk away from normally, that you should engage in, but you know, sometimes you're like, oh, I'm too tired to deal with this and I don't want to talk about this again. And, you know, but choosing reconciliation. And, you know, choosing to have those conversations because it's exhausting to have those conversations. And I know that Indigenous people have to have those conversations all the time. You know, and they're exhausted from having those conversations all the time. So it would be great if some other people had those conversations all the time too. You know, if that work was being done by everyone. And I think that that's part of choosing reconciliation, is saying that I'm going to be an active participant in this process. So in the legal sense, acknowledging and really, really accepting that the law is not neutral and that it's a powerful source in our society, and you know, it can be used the way that we need it to be. It can be used, I think, to create justice, even though I don't believe we have that right now. And so it's making a choice to consciously use the law for change. You know, how can we do that in the work that we do? And how can we move forward so that we're doing it, you know, actively and always choosing reconciliation? And then lastly, expanding our view of what law is to include Indigenous law, and that Indigenous peoples have the right to be protected by our own laws, that those laws reflect our cultures, values, and legal structures, and that they are not somehow inferior, and that they are not somehow less than, and that in fact they need to be acknowledged as what will be able to protect us best, potentially. So I think that whenever you're in a situation where you're working with Indigenous folks, clients, or colleagues, it's really important to think about what their perspective on the law is. What are their perspectives being informed by? Where do they see their own legal notions fitting into the work that's being done around them? And we can't always, unfortunately, make the courts or the state accept another source of law in that way. But, with the kind of training that the people who do this work have, we have an opportunity to really think through interesting issues about conflicts of laws, right? And that's all we're talking about. Indigenous laws are just another source of law, and we deal with conflicts of laws issues all the time. So it's not profoundly different than thinking about the way that civil and common law interact, right? It's just a matter of accepting that it's something that is possible and that we should be doing and thinking through, and using that to inform the work that we're doing. And lastly, in terms of thinking about all of this, I turn to I had a long quote that I pulled from Glenn Coulthard's book, but I decided I wouldn't, actually read this hefty and long quote. Rather, I would just focus on the sort of sentiment at the heart of it, which is this, and it's that, people, often non-Indigenous Canadians, seem to think that Aboriginal people or Indigenous people in Canada are operating from a place of resentment, when actually, at the end of the day, the feeling at the heart of that sense of injustice is bitter indignation at having been treated unfairly. And that is really not going to help with reconciliation, right? Like, until there's a sense that we're being treated fairly, until there's a sense that there is some hope for justice, and until there is a sense that people are working with Indigenous people to help achieve those things, then how can we talk about reconciliation in a meaningful way? So I think that leads us to the very last slide, which is that ultimately non-Indigenous Canadians must look to their own responsibility to learn the history of Indigenous settler relations in this country, and that without a purposeful commitment to acknowledging the truth and working through the processes of decolonization, reconciliation will remain impossible. And decolonization is something that, when I was at this conference in Whitehorse, there was oh goodness, I can't remember. There was a woman speaking, and I can't remember her name right now, which is terrible. It was just with me. Anyway, and she was talking about self-government, and she was talking about how some of the self-government agreements were sort of being done in action on the ground. And I think the panel was about decolonizing and indigenizing self-government agreements, and she got up there and said, look, I'm an Indigenous woman from an Indigenous nation where we have our own self-government agreement. We don't need to decolonize that. Like, we're indigenizing, we're good, right? But you guys need to decolonize the processes that you're involved in that are at odds with that process. So, these two things need to happen, and they need to happen together, because that's going to get us to a place where we can have a conversation in a meaningful way. So that's my presentation. And I hope that you'll have comments, questions. We can engage a little bit.
Hopefully in front of this camera. Another reminder.
Yes. You can also feel free to come up and even stand right beside me and talk into this mic.
Which is always
Yeah.
I think one of the problems is that most Canadians really don't understand or have any detail about the history. The schools are one thing, but nobody really knows the details. And it goes way back. I just got through reading a book called The Inconvenient Indian. And I was so horrified by the time I got through it. I just wanted to be sick. And again, he goes in circles trying to figure out what we can do specifically to try and resolve all these issues. It's never going to happen, but I don't think you can get through all of them because it's very complex and very different in different groups of First Nations people in North America. But the whole idea of colonization has gone on all over the world with Britain and their own tiered system. I don't know, it's very complicated. Anyway, I just wanted to make that point that I think education is going to be one of the big things.
Absolutely, I agree. Which is why I think we have such an amazing source in the TRC reports, because the executive summary is one thing, and it's 388 pages on its own. We have 94 calls to action, and that's a whole bunch of reading too, but then there's all the actual reports, and there's thousands of pages of information there.
That's what worries me.
Yeah.
I don't think I'll even take that on, but
Yeah.
To at least get snippets of it. There's a bit in the paper here and there, but it really isn't enough for us to understand it. I hope that somebody will make a movie, perhaps a documentary of several layers, because you can get a few characters that people get hooked on and they'll watch it because, you know, it is a long story.
Yeah.
I feel that that what's happening with TRC and declarations and the speaking and the stories is humbling to those of us with cultural histories from Europe. And in that experience of it, the cultural belief that Europeans were superior, I believe, is coming down into a more level playing field where there's some humility happening and some respect about what's happened on the other side. I agree with my friend that education, and I'm seeing it in the schools, where the children are learning. The Indigenous children are learning. Their graduation rate has skyrocketed lately. They have their own ceremonies, their own graduation ceremonies. And it's starting with families and the children feeling proud of who they are and what they're about. And I love that. And I think the other thing, I'm speaking to the choir here because we're all mediators, and that is so much closer to the Aboriginal way of dispute resolution and speaking and in a circle and hearing. It's not just the speaking, but it's the hearing of opposing points of view and hearing it and bringing it inside and considering it before you jump in and say something to dispute that. I could go on, but thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for your presentation.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for your words. I think that you're right. There's so much momentum right now towards change, and that I think that can truly, you know, be harnessed and moved forward. I think if we want to think about the truths that go along with it, and I think that's really it's really important. And there was something else I was going to say about what you had said. It'll come back to me. I can't remember. Darn it.
So I just want to say thanks for coming and sharing this today. I was really interested in this idea of Indigenous law, and and I hadn't thought of it before. That's kind of a new piece for me. That we have conflict of laws all the time. Why is this? Why is there such a stumbling block to get over accepting Indigenous law? And I work in the fisheries sector, right? So we're coming. I'm in that colonial structure that's still very much there, and it was very interesting. I'll just share a little story about a learning circle, actually a group, and it's a very effective kind of learning. I think she works for Ministry of Child and Family Services. It's called Building a Village for, I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's a circle process, and you actually walk through, like in person, building what a village was before, and then you go through the settler, like you go through this whole history, but you kind of go through it in the first person, like kind of role playing.
Right.
And it's incredibly powerful, but the most powerful thing that she had the woman who's running it, she had the hat on, which she said, when I have the hat on, this red hat, I'm the settler or I'm the colonizer. And then when I have it off, I'm just talking. And so as we went through the history, she had the hat on forwards, and then as the village was slowly being rebuilt, she turned the hat sideways and turned the hat backwards. But the hat was still on, and then as the colonizer coming back and say, oh, hey, now I want to work with you, I want to reconcile, what can we do together? And we just reacted so viscerally, if you still have that hat on, like that colonial structure is still there. You might have turned it sideways, you might have turned it backwards, but the red hat is still on your head. And so, this process of decolonizing the structures that we have, I just wondered if you had any more thinking around how quickly, or moves that you might be seeing happening that's starting to demonstrate that, because we're still working in these structures that are very much based, and even you referenced the Whitehorse hearings, and I heard some stuff through the media saying, it's still very much an adversarial process. They've still set up that inquiry as an adversarial process. Why do we still use that approach or that structure there? And so there seem to be some, but you know, in government, any government institution that we have is still like, and so just, I don't know, your observations on, it's going to be a long project. It took a while to get here. It's going to take a while to undo it, but if you see any signs of hope in the decolonizing project, I know we're still in the colonizing project, but is there any move towards a decolonizing project?
Yeah, I think there really is. So thank you for your words. The Indigenous Research Unit at the University of Victoria has done some fantastic work going into communities and actually doing intensive, lengthy consultations with communities, trying to help them figure out what their laws are, trying to help them put those into into case books, and then has also done some interesting work around thinking about whether some of those laws are maybe not good anymore, and like why they might not be, and how they might, you know, how a community can move forward using their own laws and legal processes, but acknowledging that some of those might need to also comply with like human rights and or, you know, gender equity, lots of other things. So there's amazing work being done in communities where that is happening. And then something else, you know, to remember, I think, for all of us is that so much of this work has already been done. Like communities themselves have already done so much of this work. And again, when I was at this conference, the panel I was speaking on was access to justice. And it was myself and the executive director of legal services in Yukon and the deputy minister of justice, and then a colleague and friend who had been part of inviting me up there to give a non-Yukon perspective, and he works directly with a First Nation. And it was interesting how, you know, the director of legal services was talking about doing community consultations and how, you know, they were going around to all the communities to try to find out what they needed in terms of like justice and what would work for their community, because there's so many different communities, and, you know, and then the minister talked about, you know, the work they were going to do to support that and why it was important, and then it came to me, and I don't play nice. So I sort of said, well, I think that actually you'll find if you talk to the people in this room who come from communities, they will tell you that they've been telling you this for decades. They have been consulting with you on this for decades. They already know what works. They've already done this work. They've already, in fact, in many cases, had processes that have made these things work, and you dismantled them, right? And then you come back and say, oh, hey, well, tell us what you want and what you need. And they're like, but we've already, we've done that 5 different times over the last 100 years. And a bunch of folks from different communities got up and said, yeah, 40 years ago, we had sentencing circles. That was something that we said we needed. They were implemented. We had them. We had circle sentencing, because that was based on our traditional knowledge. And then you stopped funding it. So we know what works for our community, you know? We know, we've done the work. We've done the work on the ground. We know what works. Just give us the freedom to do it. Like, stop imposing your structures on us and then spending all this money consulting with us again about what these things are. You know, we know, like, we're ready to go because we were doing these things and they were working, and then the rug was pulled out under us. Like, this is not okay. This has to stop happening. You know, we know what to do in our own communities that works. So I think that there are a lot of examples, amazing examples of things that are happening all over the place. I just hope that the governments listen and actually put the money into the things that they need to be putting the money into. I'm not hopeful about that right now, given this government's track record. You know, the fact that they have spent hundreds of thousands of dollars fighting Cindy Blackstock.
Yeah.
And
700,000.
yeah. Yeah. You know, they've been issued their fourth non-compliance order about not complying with that human rights decision and not funding First Nations children on reserves equally. And they are doing nothing. Well, no, they are doing something. They are actively fighting it. So, so there's lots of great stuff going on the ground, and I think that, you know, it can't continue to fall on deaf ears. Well, I hope.
All right, that's a very sad note. We need to.
I know, it's a terrible note to end on. We need to.
So we can't end. So somebody
has to do something about that.
Speak to mediation as it relates to a new way for us to merge.
So the question was, or the comment was, speak to mediation in a new way for us to
merge with Aboriginal processes.
Merge with Indigenous processes and,
Yeah.
and move forward. Well, I think that
not assimilate.
and not
Indigenous
assimilate.
practices.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. No, that's it. That's great.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I think that mediation is an amazing tool for doing this kind of work because it does engage in processes in many ways that that are more equitable, right? So it does allow more people to have voice, and exactly, it involves listening and active listening, right? Not passive listening, and witnessing, right? Which is such an important part of all of this, and that's what really, I mean, I guess is at the heart of truth telling too, is listening and witnessing, knowing that there are times that not being able to speak is a deeply important part of the process, because it means that you have to listen and you have to bear witness, even if it's uncomfortable, even if it's terrible in those moments, that's an important thing that must be done. And I think that, you know, mediators have an amazing opportunity in all the different settings that they work to engage in meaningful processes where people can actually be heard. And I don't, you know, having not been trained as a mediator myself, I don't want to attempt to tell you guys what that looks like, because that would be weird. But I know that I have been in mediations where I have been with a client, and especially in child protection matters, where having a mediator there who actually could listen to my client's concerns and actually think about what it meant to her from her Indigenous culture to be engaged in this process with the ministry, and to have to work with a social worker who wouldn't listen to her about the way that her family and her community and her culture engages in child rearing, or thinks about the rights of the children, or in fact that they even have their own laws about children's rights, that mediators have made huge differences in those situations in terms of getting social workers and getting ministry lawyers to listen and to accept that what they are doing in coming from a state sort of legislated approach is not going to benefit anyone in this circumstance, because no one's going to be able to reach consensus if they can't come out of their own perspective and listen to somebody else's. And I've been deeply appreciative of mediators in those situations, because I just tend to get angry and advocate for my client vociferously, which probably isn't helpful either. And so mediators have also been very good at shutting me down sometimes when I need to be, and saying, look, you're not being a very good listener right now, Patricia. You know, you need to stop and try to listen to what the ministry's concerns are, why they need to do it, you know, the way that they're doing it. And maybe in between those two things, we can find a way that works for your client and works for, you know, and actually works to meet the needs of the legislation and making sure that the child is protected in the way that they see fit. So I think that mediators are incredibly powerful, I don't want to call you tools, but I tell my students all the time that that's what they are, right? I tell them that they're a tool. They are a tool that can be used by the person that needs them to do the thing that they need them to do. And I think that mediators are a powerful tool in those situations, and that I know I have benefited greatly from those tools when they have been in situations where I have needed them and my client has needed them. So.
All right, I feel a need to say something just only because I really appreciate those words, Patricia, and I know that it's a fantastic moment when you're a mediator and you're involved in one of those. And as a mediator who has done a lot of child protection, and particularly Indigenous communities, one of the things I struggle the most with is the degree to which its placement within the court context consistently puts pressure to literally assimilate and the entire process, and to take away the ability to actually engage with the family. And it is something that happens constantly. It happens to all of us in every context in which we mediate. And so I agree, the mediator has this enormous power and the potential to be a tool to actually increase listening. But that mediator only does that if they come in with an awareness of their own biases, of the way that mediation itself is not a culturally neutral process, that we arrive with Western ideas about what mediation looks like, about how the process takes place, about active listening is somehow a culturally neutral tool. Not. None of the things we bring with us as mediators are culturally neutral, and as long as we have that, I think we have the potential to help in the ways that you're talking about. But just, I'm going to take it right back down again. Let's not. Let's go right back to that truth telling, because the truth telling is mediation itself isn't neutral, and we are not. Nobody's neutral going in there. So we have a huge responsibility to inform ourselves. And we're all here. Everybody's here because they want to inform themselves. And really, it's fabulous to have you here giving us this opportunity to talk about it. But I'm sorry, I just had to add that. I couldn't leave it on a positive note about mediation. It's fine, because it's not. We need to work.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a great. It looks like almost point to end on.
We're just about there, yeah.
That, you know, in a lot of cases where I've seen mediators really really want to engage with mediation principles that might come from outside of their own training, they've invited elders in.
Yeah.
Right? With the consent of, for sure, at least, you know, as far as I'm concerned, the person that matters the most is my client. But consent of the parties, so that those elders can talk about the way that it needs to happen differently, and to sort of call out the not neutrality of the way that the mediation might be happening, and it's been, those times have been incredibly powerful, and I think that I've seen some of the best results in those moments. So yeah, I think that it's really, you know, it goes back to that thing about thinking about ourselves as not experts, always, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Do we have somebody who wants to jump up for one last question? Because we're just at the end. And if not, then I'm just gonna say thank you so much to Patricia, because that's a fantastic way to kickstart us on our summer thinking, and what a fantastic lead-in to all of our thinking about Aboriginal issues this month, and maybe a little bit of thinking as we're moving in this direction of celebrating Canada. Maybe just we can go away with a few thoughts about what that looks like and what that means too. So the timing of your talk is actually wonderful to engage us in some really serious thinking, and I hope that's what's going to happen.
Yes.
So thank you so much.
No, you're very welcome, and thank you for having me and for planning it so well that I'm here at this particular time. It's almost like it was on purpose.
Almost. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you.